For most of history, wars were fought in a very predictable way. Armies met on open battlefields. Soldiers formed long lines. Generals gave orders from horseback, while drums and flags signaled movements across the field. Victory usually went to the side with the larger army, the stronger weapons, or the better-trained soldiers. This was the logic of traditional warfare. Kings built massive armies. Empires relied on discipline and organization. Battles were meant to be decisive, dramatic, and highly visible. But not every army had the luxury of fighting this way. Sometimes the weaker side faced an impossible problem. What do you do when your enemy is stronger, richer, and better equipped? What happens when facing them in a direct battle almost guarantees defeat? For centuries, the answer to that question was simple: you lose. But in the early 19th century, something unusual began happening in Spain, and it would quietly introduce a completely different way of fighting wars. The story begins in 1808, during the rise of one of the most powerful military leaders Europe had ever seen, Napoleon Bonaparte. By that time, Napoleon's armies had already defeated some of the strongest kingdoms on the continent. His forces moved quickly, fought with precision, and seemed almost unstoppable. Many European rulers had already fallen before him, and when Napoleon decided to extend his influence into Spain, few believed the Spanish could stop him. At first, it seemed they were right. French troops crossed the border. Cities were captured. Political control quickly shifted. Spain suddenly found itself under the influence of a foreign power, backed by one of the most effective armies in the world. Under normal circumstances, this would have ended the story. A stronger empire had arrived. Resistance would eventually collapse. But Spain was not responding in the usual way. Instead of gathering into one large army and confronting Napoleon directly, something different started happening across the countryside. Small groups began forming. Farmers, villagers, former soldiers, ordinary citizens who had no formal military structure. They didn't wear uniforms. They didn't march in organized formations. And they certainly didn't meet the French army on open battlefields. Instead, they attacked in ways that seemed almost invisible. A patrol traveling through the mountains might suddenly be ambushed from the trees. A supply convoy could disappear along a narrow road. A small group of fighters would strike quickly, and then vanish into the landscape before reinforcements could arrive. At first, these attacks seemed random, but slowly, a pattern began to appear. The goal was never to defeat the French army in a single massive battle. The goal was to make the occupation impossible. French soldiers could win every formal battle and still feel like they were losing control of the country, because the fighting never truly stopped. Every road became dangerous, every village uncertain, every mountain path unpredictable. This style of fighting did not rely on strength. It relied on patience, surprise, and mobility. And the Spanish had a word for the fighters carrying out these attacks: guerrilleros. The term came from the Spanish word guerra, meaning war. Guerrilla literally meant little war. At the time, it sounded almost dismissive. Small war, minor conflict, harassment rather than real combat. But the effect of this little war quickly became enormous. Napoleon's army, built for decisive battles, suddenly faced an enemy that refused to behave like a traditional army. French commanders could capture cities, but the countryside remained hostile. They could defeat organized Spanish forces, but the attacks from small groups continued. Every supply line required protection. Every patrol risked disappearing, and every victory felt temporary. Because the moment French troops moved on, resistance often returned. This was more than just frustration for Napoleon's army. It was a completely different type of war. Traditional military rules assumed battles would determine control, but the guerrilla fighters ignored those rules entirely. They attacked only when the situation favored them. They avoided large confrontations, and they used their knowledge of the land as a weapon. Mountains, forests, and narrow roads became part of the battlefield. For Napoleon's commanders, this created a constant strategic nightmare. An army designed to dominate large battles was now trapped fighting thousands of small, unpredictable conflicts. And the longer this continued, the more resources the French Empire had to commit just to maintain control. Soldiers were tied down guarding roads. Units were spread thin across wide territories. Communication became slower and more dangerous. The empire that had swept across Europe with overwhelming force was now being drained by something far less visible: small groups striking at the edges of its power. Over time, the resistance in Spain grew stronger. What had begun as scattered attacks slowly developed into a more organized movement. Local fighters shared information. Ambushes became more coordinated. French forces found themselves under constant pressure, even when no major battle was taking place. And gradually, military observers across Europe started noticing something important. The Spanish resistance was not just surviving, it was changing the logic of war itself. Because for the first time on such a large scale, a weaker force had discovered a method that allowed it to challenge a much stronger army without fighting on the enemy's terms. But the most surprising part of this story was still ahead. Because what began as an improvised strategy by desperate fighters would soon influence military thinking all over the world. And eventually, it would become one of the most powerful and widely used tactics in modern warfare. At first, many military leaders dismissed what was happening in Spain. To them, these attacks did not look like proper warfare. They looked disorganized, undisciplined, almost chaotic. Real armies fought battles. Real soldiers followed commands. Real wars were decided by major confrontations between large forces. What the Spanish fighters were doing seemed more like constant harassment than legitimate strategy. But the results were becoming impossible to ignore. French troops continued winning formal battles, yet the situation in Spain kept deteriorating. Roads remained dangerous. Supply routes were attacked again and again. Small units sent to control villages often disappeared without warning. The army that had once moved across Europe with confidence was now constantly looking over its shoulder. Napoleon himself grew increasingly frustrated. Spain had turned into something completely unexpected. Instead of a quick victory, it had become a slow and exhausting conflict that drained soldiers, resources, and attention. Historians later called it the Peninsular War, but soldiers who fought there often described it in simpler terms: a war without clear battlefields. Because the guerrilla fighters never allowed the conflict to follow predictable rules. They understood something that traditional armies often ignored. Control of territory did not always depend on winning battles. Sometimes it depended on making the enemy feel unsafe everywhere. A convoy might travel peacefully for days before suddenly being attacked in a narrow pass. A patrol could march through a village that appeared quiet, only to be ambushed hours later on the road out. Even when nothing happened, the possibility of an attack forced soldiers to stay alert at all times. That constant pressure slowly wore down morale. And while the French army struggled to adapt, the idea behind guerrilla warfare continued spreading. Because military observers were watching carefully, they realized that the Spanish fighters had unintentionally revealed a powerful rule of conflict. A weaker force could challenge a stronger one by refusing to fight the kind of battle the stronger army expected. Instead of confronting power directly, they could stretch it, exhaust it, and slowly undermine it. This was not about quick victories. It was about time. The longer the conflict lasted, the more expensive and complicated it became for the occupying force. Armies designed for decisive campaigns were suddenly trapped in endless small struggles, and over time, this approach began influencing conflicts far beyond Spain. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, different movements around the world studied the same principle. If a conventional army was too powerful to defeat directly, a smaller force could rely on mobility, secrecy, and local support. Strike when the enemy is vulnerable. Disappear before retaliation arrives. Avoid fighting on equal terms. Gradually weaken the opponent's ability to maintain control. This strategy appeared in conflicts across continents. In some cases, it helped small resistance groups challenge colonial powers. In others, it allowed local fighters to defend their territory against invading armies. Each situation was different, but the core idea remained remarkably similar. A war does not always belong to the strongest army. Sometimes it belongs to the side that controls the rhythm of the conflict. And guerrilla warfare was built entirely around that idea. Instead of massive confrontations, it relied on constant disruption. Instead of speed and dominance, it relied on patience. Instead of overwhelming force, it relied on unpredictability. Over time, military thinkers began studying these tactics more seriously. They noticed that guerrilla fighters often shared certain advantages. They understood the terrain better than invading forces. They blended into the local population, and they were able to choose when and where each attack happened. That flexibility made them extremely difficult to eliminate. Even large armies with superior weapons could struggle for years trying to suppress small groups operating this way. In many conflicts, the cost of maintaining control eventually became too high. And when that happened, the stronger army often faced a difficult decision: continue fighting an endless war or withdraw. Looking back, the events in Spain during Napoleon's invasion revealed something profound. The Spanish fighters did not invent the idea of ambushes or surprise attacks. Those had existed for centuries, but what they demonstrated was a new rule of warfare, that these tactics could form the foundation of an entire strategy, a system where small, scattered forces could collectively challenge one of the most powerful empires of the time. And once that rule appeared, it changed how future conflicts would be fought. Generals began realizing that victory was not always about battlefield dominance. Sometimes it was about endurance. Sometimes it was about adapting faster than the enemy. And sometimes the smallest groups could create the biggest strategic problems. Today, the word guerrilla is widely recognized in military discussions. But when it first emerged during the conflict in Spain, it described something that seemed almost insignificant: a little war. Yet that little war forced one of the greatest armies in Europe to confront a completely unfamiliar challenge, a challenge that would echo through military history for generations. Because from that moment forward, every powerful army had to consider a new possibility, that somewhere, hidden in mountains, forests, or crowded cities, a smaller force might be preparing to fight a very different kind of war. And if they followed the same rule first seen in Spain, the battlefield might never look the same again. If you want to explore more of the hidden rules that changed history, make sure to subscribe.